Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and another installment of Marshal Mayhem. The brilliant Rachael Stark returns, and today we are talking about the guy that I think we can safely say is Napoleon's right-hand man. In what I think was the last episode, we talked about Josephine and said that Josephine was the one that basically, and this is Rachel's words, not mine, I'm not claiming credit for them. Josephine was the one who made Napoleon palatable to society, which is a really good point. But if Josephine was the one that made Napoleon palatable to society, you could make the argument that Berthier, the guy who we're going to be talking about today, is the one who basically made Napoleon sort of palatable to the army, not in a sort of socially acceptable sense, but in terms of a here's my idea, now go make it happen sort of sense. So I think there's going to be a lot of love for Berthier over the course of the evening. We're going to talk about various aspects of his personality. The show notes say that at one point he does a Nelson, which we'll get to that. But yeah, the guy who makes Napoleon for me. Rachel, great to see you. I hope I haven't stolen any of your kind of quotes and points in that waffly introduction. How are you doing?
Well, yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me back again to chat more Marshall things.
So let's dive in. Berthier, curious kind of starting point because he's army in his origins, isn't he? I'm not going to sit here and I've read Chandler. I must say, I probably shouldn't say this, but I am going to say this. I read the chapter that read the episode in Chandler. This is going to go well, isn't it? I read the chapter in Chandler, and I I I wasn't a fan of it. I just wasn't. I got a very kind of confused picture of the guy from the thing that had been written, but perhaps I just wasn't a fan of the style of the way that it was written. It was sort of written in a very grandiose style with lots of flowery stuff thrown in, and just kind of thought, can we get to the meat of what's going on here? But the bottom line from that was Daddy Berthier is a military man. Is it
Mhm.
topographical engineers? Did I remember that
Yes,
right?
he is. Yeah. So in a way, Berthier's the most military almost of any of the marshals. It's in his youth, his father, Jean-Baptiste Berthier, is very keen that his sons, he has four sons, who all end up in the military, that they will have that sort of thorough education that will, encourage Berthier's talents in mathematics. They will have the education that will prepare them for military life. And as would be expected, when he's 13, Berthier follows in his father's footsteps and becomes a topographical engineer. He's ideally suited for it because it doesn't matter whether you read something, whether it's written by Berthier's cheerleaders or his detractors, everybody can agree he has the most meticulous attention to detail. He's got a phenomenal memory. He can recall where everybody's supposed to be at any given time. He's almost indefatigable in his energy. He's just ideally, if people are born for a role, Berthier was born to be Napoleon's chief of staff. He is 100% through and through military.
But he's also sort of royal. No, he's that's badly phrased, but he's got very strong sort of ancien regime connections, right? When you look at his early service record, this is a guy who's sort of embedded in the ancien regime army, is kind of working his way up, and then of course the revolution happens, and because he's got all of these connections, that's kind of a problem for him. I guess I'm probably sort of jumping ahead because we do need to talk about America in just a moment, but it does strike me that this is sort of he's obviously nobody's expecting the revolution, but he has spent so much time trying to work his way up the ranks of the royalist army that when it all goes wrong, it's well wrong for the king. That's kind of a problem because he's, if I remember this right, he's got a role to play in some of the French royal family trying to escape, even.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's got connections to the royal family sort of throughout his whole early life. He's literally born at Versailles. His father's in the service of the king. I mean, they're from humble origins, but his father sort of started the social mobility. His mother is a maid to the future Louis XVIII. So he is very much connected to the royal family. And yeah, is one of the older marshals. He begins his military life in the Ancien Regime army compared to a lot of them who enter as private soldiers at the time of the revolution. So he sort of is almost the opposite direction. And yeah, when he returns from America, he finds himself as a Ancien Regime man in a totally different situation. And yeah, he is. We Most sources believe that he is instrumental in the escape of the Comte d'Artois and two of Louis's aunts, getting them to safety. So it's a pretty significant part to play.
It is slightly baffling that he manages to keep his head, but perhaps we'll get to sort of the politics of the revolution in due course, because it ends up being quite complex for him. But you picked up on something there, which is the American service, and that's unusual to an extent. Obviously, there's a French contingent that goes out there, and I'm not saying that those people are irrelevant, but of the marshals, that experience is a bit on the unusual side, isn't it?
Yes, there's only two of the marshals who serve in America. Bertie is the only one who does so as an officer. The other is Jean-Baptiste Jourdan. His experience is very different. Jourdan goes to America as a private soldier. He is very much, the typical martial story, if I can use that in inverted commas. He's a private soldier who works his way up. Berthier goes out there as a young officer, a young captain, and he's attached to Rochambeau's staff as a sort of supernumerary assistant. And that's when his sort of meticulous attention to detail captures the attention of Rochambeau, and he realizes that Bertie is a real talent that needs to sort of be nurtured. And he asks the young Bertie to draw maps of the Newport camp, some of which get sent, back to France. And I was kind of tweeting about this yesterday. A huge number of Berthier's documents from that time are now in the Princeton collection. They weren't really sort of discovered, as it were, until the last century. They were acquired from one of Berthier's last descendants and handed over to the University of Princeton in the 1930s. And quite a lot of them are digitized. So it's really incredibly easy if you're not American or are not likely to be in America at any point to actually go and have a look at these documents. And you can see Berthier's very, very neat, very meticulous handwriting. And you sort of, in as much as you can get a feel for somebody from their handwriting, you get the sense that this is a guy who loves order and method and detail. And his maps are something else. They're just exquisite looking at them. It really honestly blows me away just taking a glance at them. So if you are interested in Berthier, I really encourage you to go and have a flick through those documents. They're incredible. But it means that because he was so intrinsic in his detail, you can virtually follow the progress of the French army step by step through the entire journey. He kept a journal as well as all of his other duties at the time, and he laid his journal out in three columns. And the first column was the orders of the day, recounted exactly. The next column was his observations on the topography and the countryside, and anything else sort of eye-catching that drew his attention. And then the third were his personal observations. So you really do get this almost window into the life of the French army at the time. And that's a really incredible sort of valuable, priceless resource, because Bertie didn't leave memoirs as such. There's access to some of his correspondence and his papers, but given the nature of his ending, he didn't have the opportunity that some of the other marshals had in later life to sort of air his side of the story. So it's really interesting to see things through Berthier's eyes in America.
I don't know how he found the time, quite frankly, to go into this incredible level of detail. It's funny, isn't it? You can always kind of look at this and go, well, you're sort of searching for somebody's characteristics in their handwriting sometimes. That doesn't apply to Wellington. Wellington's handwriting is an absolute picking nightmare. It doesn't help that he had a habit of using soft-leaded pencils, which kind of, when documents kind of sit there for a long time, obviously it kind of smudges a touch and it sort of degrades ever so slightly. So I know it is a pet peeve of the Special Collections Department at Southampton University that they just wish they could have confiscated his soft-leaded pencils because it would have made their life that much easier.
My lovely
Uh,
pen instead.
yeah, but reading his handwriting is tough. It's nowhere near like the Clark handwriting. But from what you're saying, Berthier, the meticulous guy, is meticulous about everything in his life, and that includes how he writes stuff down and the way in which he does it.
It's consistent to the nth degree. The lines are evenly spaced. It is just absolute order and method to a T on paper.
So, whilst we're talking about personalities, what is he like as a person? I guess we'll talk about kind of personal life in a bit, but in terms of his character and his dealings with people, I get the impression he's not one for rubbing people up the wrong way, particularly.
Yes and no is the honest answer, which I know isn't particularly helpful. But a bit like Napoleon, he's this sort of dichotomy of characteristics in that he is, of the marshals, probably in terms of personality, one of the most mild-mannered. He's in some cases even described as meek. He puts up with Napoleon speaking to him, appallingly in some circumstances, tells him that he's worthless and, is really quite cruel to him. And he's, dramatically head over heels in love with Madame Visconti. So he's almost this sort of romantic, mild-mannered character in that sense. He does not always deal very well with the other marshals. Imagine that. Spot the theme. But he could, in as much as he likes order and method, the problem is he's one of those people, because that is the standard he sets for himself, he expects that of everybody else. And if he has written an order expecting someone to be here by 6 o'clock in the evening, he expects that person to be there by 6 o'clock in the evening. He's not an adaptive person. He likes things done as and when they are expected to be so, and he's not always appreciative that circumstances change. The weather can change. There can be unexpected circumstances that have held somebody up, whatever. He's quite regimental. He's not particularly adaptive. He's not especially imaginative either. He's very stolid, very straightforward in his military dealings. And there's a quote that I thought was quite interesting, in as much as it's a total opposite of the meek, mild-manneredness that's described elsewhere. He could be demandingly harsh in terms of negotiating with other people, but he could never concede with grace. So I don't think he was a particularly easy person to deal with in a lot of senses as well. He could be incredibly pompous. He could be very condescending to some of the other marshals. I think La is at one point noted as describing him as an absolute prick, would be the translation. He exists in a mutual triangle of loathing with Bernadotte and Davout. So he doesn't always play nice with the other marshals as well, but that's not exactly an uncommon theme. I think if we take Mortier, Moncey, and Lefebvre out, there's very few of them who did.
Oh, honestly, we need a kind of Real Housewives of the Napoleonic Wars as like a spoof mockumentary thing, because all of this infighting and these insults are just hilarious. It would genuinely be like, I don't know, Real Housewives of insert place here. It genuinely would. Um, Back on track though, the revolution. How does he navigate this? Because it's a dangerous time, right? And if you're not very careful during this period, as we've said in the past, there's scope to lose your head, and everybody knows that. So how does he manage to sort of have this role in helping members of the royal family to escape, and yet also manage to keep breathing? Because, that's not going to go down particularly well with the powers that be.
Yeah, he has a comparably quiet revolution compared to quite a lot of the other marshals. He comes back from America and is serving as a commander at Versailles. And as we've already mentioned, he's instrumental in helping most sources agree, at least the Comte d'Artois, the Polignacs, and two of Louis's aunts escape. But then he's employed by Rochambeau and by Lafayette as chief of staff, and this is where he starts to come into his own. And I think in some ways his performance was just so effective that nobody could really doubt he was given his all. He certainly couldn't be chastised as doing too little. And because he was in an administrative capacity for a lot of the time, he also couldn't be slated for doing too much and risking too much. But even then, he's very sort of in, out, because he is suspended from all duties at one point and then is recalled to be reinstated as chief of staff and then dismissed the following year. So it was very much kind of, you can serve, no, you can't serve, you can serve, no, you can't serve. Then eventually he enlists as a private in the Army of the West. So this is where he almost starts a similar sort of journey to the other marshals. But thanks to Carnot's influence, and Carnot had a lot of time for Berthier compared to some of the other commanders at the time. And I think he recognised that Berthier was a reliable, not too excitable, not too imaginative sort of man who would do as he was told. He could be trusted not to kind of go off on his own tangent. Carnot has him reinstated as chief of staff to the armies of the Alps and Italy, which brought him into contact with a future Marshal, well, Kellerman, who would become Marshal Kellerman. And it's in that position, as he reorganizes the staff office into its separate divisions, using that strategy that will serve him well for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. That's the time where he comes into contact with the young General Bonaparte. So it's those sort of, realistically, the time where he comes back from America pre-revolution, I reckon are about the last quiet years he ever has.
Well, yeah, because I mean it's non-stop after that. Well, more or less, isn't it? Maybe you could make the argument that 1810 is on the quiet side for him, but that's about it, really. Because 1811, it's all about Russia. So yeah, he's a busy guy, put it that way. But the system that he creates is remarkable and phenomenal. Reading up into it, it's very much made, or I get the impression that it's very much made in Berthier's image. You know, it works for Berthier, and it's a system that wouldn't necessarily work for somebody else. You know, there are things that you look at and go, well, isn't X going to overlap with Y? But it's actually effectively you've got these sort of different, I think it's 4 divisions, isn't it?
Yes.
That each do a separate thing. Do you want to just kind of talk people through those different divisions and the way in which they operate? Because I think that kind of gives us an insight into at least Berthier's vision for a staff, which then kind of de facto becomes Napoleon's staff system, if nothing else.
Yeah, so I'm going to read verbatim here because I'll inevitably forget something or I'll express something incorrectly and somebody will tweet me irately. The staff was subdivided into several divisions. The first division comprising Berthier's personal offices, that is, the services working on matters demanding his immediate decisional attention. The second division provided the material needs, armament, equipment, clothing, food, forage, remounts, etc. Inspection, particularly of food and forage, was the domain of the third division, which was also responsible for intelligence and reconnaissance. The fourth division was in charge of army quarters and police matters, besides keeping the roster of liaison posts and guides.
So there you have it, folks. That is the breakdown. When Napoleon pitches up to the army in northern Italy, is there any indication of what the early interactions are like? Does Napoleon sort of start telling Berthier, well, maybe you should try doing it this way? Because, I mean, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Somebody telling, we now look back at the idea of somebody telling Berthier how to do his job as quite amusing. Does Napoleon just let Berthier get on with it? Or does he have, because Napoleon comes with his own not exactly staff, but his own sort of systems and his own visions of how things should work and his own sort of entourage that Berthier then needs to slot into. So how does it play out?
Yeah, I mean, Bertie is actually established in the role pre-Napoleon, and it's not clear whether Napoleon's staff initially complimented Berthier's, but I think it is clear that Napoleon was a guy who recognized talent when he saw it, and he 100% realized that Berthier was the man for the job. And eventually, Berthier was involved in, helping Napoleon draft the bulletins that would be sent back. He was very, very quick in becoming an integral part of Napoleon's successes. There's no doubt that whether Berthier had existed or not, Napoleon would have worked his way up there because that was his character and that was his force of personality. But the efficiency of the army, the dependability of his orders being translated. I mean, Berthier was a fluent kind of conduit for Napoleon's wishes. Would that have been as successful with somebody else? I genuinely doubt it. Equally, I don't think Berthier, who was sort of bowled over by Napoleon's personality and essentially gave way to him whenever he demanded it, I don't think necessarily Berthier would have worked as successfully as he did necessarily paired up with some of the other generals. I mean, if he had been Davout's chief of staff, I don't know how well that would have worked. Had he been with somebody like Massena, again, I'm not sure. They just seemed to complement each other perfectly. Napoleon had all the drive and ambition and imagination. Berthier was the details guy. Napoleon was 200% personality. Berthier was quite happy to do as he was told.
Absolutely. But I mean, the best indication of how badly things can go wrong for Napoleon when he doesn't have Berthier is, of course, when he doesn't have Berthier in the Waterloo campaign. And, the endless speculation is, of course, what if Napoleon had had Berthier at Waterloo? And personally, I sign up to this idea that there's a lot that would have played out differently. There's a lot of sort of fumbling that goes on during the Waterloo campaign that you just don't really expect of Berthier. In terms of the practicalities of what Berthier's got to do to make Napoleon's vision work, give us kind of a bit of a sense of how this works in practice. Do they kind of sit down and plan campaigns together, or does Napoleon go, look, this is what's going to happen, and then Berthier has to go and make it so?
Well, a bit of a combination of both, because Napoleon was a guy who could, he could act quite quickly. Again, he was the one with the imagination and with the drive. He would envision the bigger picture, but Napoleon's handwriting also awful. And Berthier was one of the few who could read it, and he was the one who would have to translate whatever sort of vision Napoleon had into this, achievable operational orders to know who it was being sent out to. And it was said that it didn't matter what time of day or where you were when you spoke to Berthier, he knew where everybody was supposed to be. So Napoleon had the bigger picture in his head. Berthier had the sort of picture of reality in his head that could put two and two together and say, well, here's how we make this work.
And the maps are quite key in all of this, aren't they? Because Berthier's got this whole kind of system of different colored pins that show what they think about the enemy position, and where is X Corps, where are the logistics and all the rest of it. And I gather, again, this is coming from the Chandler chapter, that basically if Napoleon wants to know where the army is, he basically goes to Berthier's tent or headquarters or whatever, and looks at the maps that Berthier's drawing up. Is that right?
Yeah, I think this is where it pays off when you have got a very methodical topographical engineer as your chief of staff. You reap the benefits in that sense. Excuse me.
So when it comes to the success on the battlefield, obviously we do a lot of kind of talking about Berthier as the chief of staff. In terms of him as a commander, what's his record like? Because I've got the impression that Berthier as a commander is sort of okay but mediocre, and yet the Chandler chapter sort of gives a much what's the word I'm looking for? A much sort of kinder assessment. An awful adjective, but it's more favorable. That's what I'm looking for. In terms of Berthier's success. What's your reading of it?
I think you couldn't question his physical courage, and I think that's the key element of it. Some accounts write him as this sort of very weak. He's never described as cowardly, but you get the impression of a sort of desk jockey who wasn't a real soldier in inverted commas. But he does have real physical courage. You know, he is one of the officers involved charging at Lodi. He is at Rivoli. He fights there. He sustains several battlefield wounds throughout the course of his career. So, in terms of as a soldier, he's not any less brave than any of the other marshals. But he is one of the marshals who is not suited to being an independent commander. He's very much one of those who works best when Napoleon's in charge. He's not at the level you would place Massena or Davout or Suchet or Lat, who, as independent commanders, would make the right decisions and have the confidence and, imagination to put their men in the position to get to victory. And you see that in 1809 when Berthier is left to take command of the army and very, very nearly leads Marshal Davout into disaster. And it's only Napoleon's very timely arrival to rectify the situation that sort of gets Marshal Davout back to safety, where he was in real danger of being left isolated at the mercy of Archduke Charles. Berthier, he had mismanaged things, and I think again that's the difference, where he had to translate orders, where he had to make numbers work, where he had to make logistics work. He is in his element, and Napoleon said, as chief of staff, he had no equal, but as a commander, he wasn't fit to have more than 500 men. And that's quite scathing, but I do think he didn't have the independent confidence or strategic vision to command troops on his own, which is no negative thing. Quite a lot of the marshals were in that sort of bracket. They worked best when Napoleon was there, but it's definitely true of Berthier.
Yeah, it's a good point. Sort of Napoleon is the glue that binds these people together, right? And you put them all together in the right order, and then they're brilliant. But you take an individual and push them too far above their skill set, and it all goes horribly wrong. That is brutal, though. Not fit to command more than 500 men.
It's one of those kind of catch-22s, because Napoleon would complain when some of the marshals were given independent command and didn't perform well, besides that sort of small nucleus I've mentioned. But equally, he was not a guy who encouraged his marshals to make independent decisions. He was the one who would say to Berthier, only I know what is needed. He liked his orders followed to the letter, which is why Berthier suited him so ideally. So in some senses, it's almost not the marshal's fault in some cases. It could be quite a harsh judgment to say, well, I don't want you to ever show initiative, and then I'm going to lambast you when you do. But yeah, it's quite scathing, but I think it's probably too scathing. But I wouldn't want to be a soldier led by Berthier as overall commander.
No, although having Berthier in charge of your logistics is, a good thing. Absolutely. Yeah, that thing of sort of, I want my junior commanders to do exactly what I say when I say it, but then also show initiative on occasion, but critique them for doing so or not doing so, depending on whether or not that fits my overall strategic vision. It is very much sort of the thing that Wellington does as well. That's a very significant kind of area of similarity between the two of them. Berthier's obviously integral to Napoleon's success. You can't get away from that. And that's reflected in the marshals. And, I guess it's important at this point that we do talk about that. But I'm also interested in whether or not the fact that because Berthier is so important to Napoleon, and everybody knows that Berthier is important to Napoleon, does that therefore mean that he gets shielded in any particular way? Is Napoleon sort of inclined to go, look, I absolutely need you by my side, so you stay by my side during this particular part of the campaign or during this particular part of a battle. I mean, obviously he's wounded, so it's not as though he's kind of kept, 3 miles behind the front line.
Oh.
But I'm just curious about that kind of sense of needing to protect your best assets. And clearly, Berthier is probably Napoleon's best asset besides Napoleon.
Well, I mean, he's nicknamed by troops at some point the Emperor's wife because he spends so much time with Napoleon. But I mean, I would argue that that's not necessarily protecting him because the workload that is expected of Berthier is unbelievable. I mean, I said the guy was indefatigable, but he really has to prove that. And again, Napoleon is one of these people who has tremendous capacity for work and nearly inexhaustible energy, but expects that in his subordinates. And Napoleon would work, 20-hour days, and Berthier had to do likewise. He would travel with Napoleon in his carriage, but this isn't exactly, a social situation. They're not sitting having a, nice relaxing sit down in a little chat. They're working the entire time. He's dictating orders. He's taking notes. There's a sort of setup where Napoleon can recline slightly to sleep. Berthier has to sleep sitting upright. The fact that he doesn't have an immense mental breakdown from sheer overwork, years before Waterloo is incredible because, my God, he puts the hours in. The amount of work he does almost defies belief. And prepping for this episode, I just had this whole, I mean, I've always looked quite favourably at Berthier, just A, he's essential, and B, as a person, he's relatively inoffensive. But the sympathy, just feeling from looking at the amount of work he does, yeah, it's something else.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows that Napoleon and Berthier are almost two sides of the same coin when it comes to the French success in the Napoleonic Wars, right? And it's something that I hadn't really considered, that actually, yeah, Napoleon, because he is so driven, it therefore forces others to raise their game to match him, because otherwise you just can't keep up. And it's remarkable that he doesn't burn through more individuals, if you know what I mean. I mean, there are some people who sort of fall by the wayside, of course there are, but there isn't that sense of sort of Napoleon gets through hundreds of individuals, I guess in part because Berthier's good enough and he can rise to the challenge. And I guess that's why he's top of the list, right, when it comes to the Marshals list in 1804.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is the maxim as well that extraordinary times bring extraordinary people to the fore. And due to the revolution, and you can say what you like about Napoleon, but all of the marshals deserved those batons in one way, shape, or form. And it's reflected that, by promoting high performance individuals, you get the successes that he does. He brings on, because he isn't hampered by the sort of class system a la, the British officer class. He brings on really stellar individuals, but it's absolutely deserved, I think, that Bertie is top of the list, because you could argue justifiably, I think, that there are various other marshals who are essential to a key point in Napoleon's story. If Murat's not there on the 13th Vendémiaire, is Napoleon just the name of a young officer who's massacred by the mob? If Massena's not holding out, really heroically at Genoa, does Marengo have a different outcome? If you don't have Davout's sort of magnum opus at Erstadt, what happens to the outcome of Jena? So there's, elements where all of them play this really key role. But I feel like Berthier is the one who plays the key role all the time. You take Berthier out of the equation, and I think you would see a different outcome.
And in fairness, he does get rewarded for that in a considerable number of ways, doesn't he?
He is very well rewarded materially. So he comes top of the list of the marshals, of the original list of marshals in 1804, which effectively makes him, the grand old man of the marshalate. There's quite a list of titles. I mean, he is named Grand Huntsman of the Empire. He's given a Grand Eagle of the Legion of Honor. He is the first of the marshals to be given a further title. He's named the Prince of Neuchâtel, which comes with a huge financial endowment as well, and not just from Napoleon, but from French allies as well. So in addition to the Princedom of Neuchâtel, he's made a Grand Dignitary of the Iron Crown of Italy, later a Vice Constable. He's given the Grand Cross of the Order of Military Merit of Maximilian Joseph of Bavaria, the Grand Cross of St. Henry of Saxony, the Grand Cross of Fidelity of Baden, the Grand Cross of Hesse. He's a Knight of the Gold Eagle of Württemberg, Knight of the Crown of Saxony, Grand Commander of the Crown of Westphalia, Knight of the Black Eagle in Prussia, and by the Russians made a Knight of St. Andre. So he's not short of a title or two.
Can you imagine trying to introduce him at like one of those dignified courtier scenarios where they announce the names and the titles of the individual? You just go, here's Berthier. He's quite important. I couldn't be bothered to go through all of those grand crosses and grand knights and all the rest of it.
He's a knight of it.
That's a very long list of titles.
Actually, he's very well off as well. His eventual various financial endowments come to 1.3 million a year. So of all the marshals, he gets the biggest financial reward. And again, you would say, well, deservedly so, but it's a lot of money. When he gets the princedom of Neuchâtel, over the 7 years he holds that title, 610,000 livres, almost half the gross revenue of that principality, goes into Berthier's personal account.
I mean, that's not bad, is it?
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
That's quite the paycheck. The obvious thing to berate him for is the Moscow campaign, right? Here is the master of logistics, and yet logistics fail almost from the get-go with the Russia campaign. But it's always struck me as a sort of slightly lazy thing to try and beat him around the head with, because it's an army of 500,000 and the transport network is just horrific. Is that fair in terms of an assessment? Is there any sense that he was perhaps flagging by the time it got to the 1812 campaign and, everybody goes past their best and perhaps he could have done more? Or was it just an impossible scenario when nobody should realistically have tried to march into Russia with an army of 500,000?
Combination, I think, of all of it. I mean, there's accounts of him being driven pretty much to tears to say, excuse me, a private soldier has a better experience than I do. I've been given all these titles and all this land, and I never have a minute to enjoy it, because he was constantly being driven to do more and more and more. And it is suggested that he actually cautioned Napoleon not to overextend his lines going into Russia, and was not listened to. We discussed on the Poniatowski episode that Poniatowski had advised Napoleon to take a different route, which also might have helped. I think Napoleon at that stage was at that point where he believed he was invincible and genuinely believed this was going to be a quick campaign and Alexander would be cowed and it would all be resolved. So I think there is a degree it was just a completely impossible scenario, but there wasn't enough attention paid to the issue around, horses, transport. Would you might have expected better of Berthier? Yes, but was that just because everybody had expected Berthier to be a miracle worker and it got to the stage that there realistically could be no more miracles?
Yeah, I mean, like we say, sometimes it just doesn't work. And when you've got numbers that big, Mark Thompson recently did a paper just on the logistics of trying to get a siege train into the field and the number of wagons that you need, because it's not just you need the wagons to transport the food or the ammunition. You've then got the beasts of burden that have got to move those wagons. So then you need more wagons because you've got to supply the fodder for those animals. And then because you need the fodder wagons, you've got to have animals to move those, which means you then need more fodder and more fodder. And it's an endless thing. So to move an army of 500,000 men would have had a train behind it that was just insane in
Yeah.
scale. And sure, he's got a staff, but to make all of that happen is, it's not to say he didn't try his best, but it's as close to a task as impossible can be.
Yeah.
It feels like that's it.
I think Russia's a bit like Spain in that it didn't matter who you'd put into that role, and there really was nobody better than Berthier for pulling the logistics together. It wouldn't have mattered who had done it. I don't think it was achievable.
So let's move on to talk about his personal life. We talked about him in terms of his character. This is where we get to the whole doing a Nelson thing. So tell us more.
Yes, when in Italy, Berthier fell very passionately in love with an Italian singer named Giuseppina Visconti, who was married to an Italian diplomat. And he was very much, you know, head over heels, the full picture, absolutely besotted with her. She could be less so with him. She was very fond of him when he was there, but she was not totally against receiving attentions from anybody else when he wasn't. But Berthier, she owned his heart completely and utterly. And Napoleon was just adamantly against this. He wouldn't receive her at Malmaison, despite Josephine being slightly more kinder in that regard. And he would berate Berthier for the attachment. And eventually, as the new emperor's taken stock, he wanted the unmarried marshals to make good dynastic matches because he wants to build all these connections with his fledgling court for this air of legitimacy. And aging Italian mistresses are not what he has in mind for his right hand man. And he eventually sends Bertie this letter. It says, "Your passion has lasted too long. It has become ridiculous, and I have the right to hope that the one whom I have called my comrade in arms, whom posterity will place everywhere beside me, will no longer remain abandoned to an unexampled weakness. So I want you to get married. Otherwise, I shall see you no more. You are 50 years old, but you're of a race where one lives for 80, and these next 30 years to be born are those where the sweetness of a marriage is more needed." So his options are get married or else. And so he is effectively strong armed by Napoleon into marrying Duchess Maria Elizabeth in Bavaria, who's a niece of Maximilian. He's 56 at the time of the wedding. She's 24. This is not a situation I would have wished on any woman. She's 24. She's married to a guy literally more than twice her age, who is very much in love with somebody else. And then to add insult to injury in Berthier's eyes, less than 2 weeks after their wedding, Madame Visconti's husband dies. And he's heard to lament that, if he could have just withstood Napoleon a little bit longer, she would have been his wife. But the reality is that a vulgar Italian singer is not, and that's Napoleon's description of her, I'm not having a go, is not who he had envisaged for Berthier. So Berthier just decides to move the newly widowed Madame Visconti to his home with his new wife of 2 weeks.
As you do. Yeah, I mean, we were talking, the word prick featured earlier in this episode. It's going to feature again in relation to Napoleon in this instance. That's a really prickish letter to send to somebody. And there's more insult to injury, actually, because when Bertie and Napoleon have a conversation about Madame Visconti's husband dying, Napoleon just laughs. Like full on, almost like Nelson out of the Simpsons, going ha ha at him. Yeah, just vile. But the one to really feel sorry for is Berthier's wife. in all
Yeah,
this.
it's really not a nice situation at all, as we say. I mean, let's face it, she's not going to have had a huge amount of input in the matter of her marriage anyway. She's been married off to someone, as I say, literally more than twice her age, and then to be in that situation again, um, you really feel for the woman. And there's a letter surviving from Hortense to her brother, basically expressing astonishment that she could ever put up with that situation. That how on earth could she stand it? But in Chardonnay's work on the Marshals, he has a whole chapter on their wives, and he describes her as being, not very beautiful. Of course, they had to describe that first. But then by saying that she had such a dignity about her that nobody would ever have mocked her to her face, that she had a simplicity and integrity, and she was a very caring individual. And of course, eventually they came to some sort of harmony, that she lived alongside Madame Visconti and would play cards with her, and they would eventually kind of share gossip together. But I guess if you've been married off in the situation that she was, maybe she was glad that somebody else was bothering with Bertie and that she didn't have to.
I suppose there is that. It's quite clear who was going to occupy the majority of Berthier's attentions when he was home. And so, if somebody else is going to do that, then it means that she doesn't have to. Um, do
I
they
mean,
end
that's
up do they end up having
speculation, but
kids?
yeah, they do. So, interestingly enough, just as Miss Madame Visconti's health takes a turn for the worst, she suffers what appears to be a stroke, and she becomes very overweight. Her limbs swell up. But it is noted that Bertie does treat her with an incredible amount of kindness as her health deteriorates. But around that period, Napoleon Berthier, who is Berthier's only son and successor to his title, is born in 1810. Caroline Berthier is born in 1812, and Maria is pregnant with their third child at the time of Berthier's death in 1815.
Napoleon and Caroline, eh? He
I
he
mean,
went down there.
there's a lot of Napoleons amongst the next generation of the Marshal. It must have been tremendously awkward in the Restoration.
Funnily enough, in Southampton Old Cemetery, there is a Napoleon Dupont. Um, he was actually a school teacher, but he is son of Dupont, the general. And for reasons that I'm not 100% familiar with, he ends up in Southampton, and he's buried there in a fairly impressive looking tomb. It's got to be said. So yeah, it's a funny one to just sort of be wandering around that cemetery and then see the name Napoleon pop up. But I imagine in France it's actually quite popular. Well, popular, common at the very least. Certainly up until 1815.
Yeah, I mean, there's off the top of my head, there's at least, I mean, Bessier's son's called Napoleon. Davout has, it's not his given name, but it's hyphenated. And yeah, there's an awful lot of Louis Napoleons or simple Napoleons.
So we've alluded to this at a few points the whole way through. When it comes to Berthier's death, it's untimely. There's no other way to put it. And there's always been the speculation, hasn't there? Because Berthier's like all of the marshals, really, that Berthier has to have a tough conversation with himself about what the hell's he going to do when Napoleon comes back in 1815. And ultimately, the conversation runs that when it comes to his death, did he fall? Was he pushed? Or did he jump? So talk us through the route to that, and then what your assessment is of the situation.
Yeah, Berthier in particular was in a real difficult situation when Napoleon returned, because like a lot of the marshals, he had made his oath to the Bourbons at the Restoration. And again, like many of the marshals, we discussed this in the MacDonald episode, his word meant something. And I know the sort of popular image, particularly in some British circles that the marshals were, a load of rogues. That's not true. For a lot of them, their word really, really did count. These are not sort of horrible men. In a lot of cases, they are very good men, in as much as you can say that of a military figure of the time. And Berthier finds himself in this situation where he's torn between his obvious connection to Napoleon, um, you know, heavily charged though that had been, Napoleon could be very harsh with him and had forced him into marriage. But there was that connection, and he obviously was to a degree still overawed by Napoleon. He's made this oath to the Bourbons, and he finds himself in the position of being distrusted by both sides, which must have felt quite depressing for him. And he withdraws back to Bamberg, to where his in-laws are residing. And realistically, we're never going to know how Berthier died, because the only person who knows has been dead for 200 years. And there's a tremendous amount of speculation. I think because there have been these instances where it's clear that Berthier's mental health must have been suffering a little bit. The quotes earlier on about how a private soldier had a better existence because he never had a minute's peace. The account of him being, in tears when Napoleon left him behind when he left the army at Russia. And if I know I've mentioned it on a couple of these episodes before, but if you have not followed Andrew Brunati's work on Twitter in regards to the mental health of Viscount Castlereagh, I really recommend it, because he's done a tremendous, and I know there's a paper coming, but some of the threads he's posted about the impact of prolonged, high intensity, high pressure work on Castlereagh at the time, and how that impacted his mental health is really interesting. And I think there is a direct parallel with Berthier. Their circumstances were not identical, but Berthier too had done a tremendously hard job for a very, very long time. And when you look at the breakdowns of what research is the impact of chronic stress on mental health, one of the key factors is labour intensity and working time, and how vulnerable would somebody be if they've done a high volume of work, have had pressure at work, high complexity of work, night or shift work, long working hours, non-standard working time, and work-family life imbalance. That's basically Berthier's entire life for 20 years. So I think that because we have that knowledge that Berthier has been pushed so hard for so long, I think that's why there's so much speculation. But there's no eyewitness. There's an awful lot of hearsay about it. Some accounts say he'd started drinking quite a bit at that period of time, but again, that's not substantiated. A lot of that, again, is pure speculation. But what we do know is on the 1st of June, 1815, Berthier falls from a third-floor window at his in-laws' residence and dies. And there's some quite gory images sort of mocked up to represent that at the time. But the family sort of certainly treated it or acted as though it was an accident, and that's hardly surprising given the way suicide was stigmatized at the time. So if he had died by suicide, they were hardly going to admit it. It is possible, Berthier was rheumatic. He'd suffered from that for quite a while. It is possible that he simply he'd been looking out the window, apparently to observe Russian troop movements. It's entirely possible he just fell. His brother César actually died through complications of a seizure. He had suffered a fit and fallen into water and then drowned. So is it totally out with the realm of possibility that in a high stress situation, Berthier maybe suffered one likewise and again overbalanced? Not impossible, though again, we'll never know. But there is, again, the possibility that he took his own life. So he had apparently, before going up to the third floor room, had gone to see his two children who were just preparing to go out for a walk with their governess, and then had climbed the stairs. Now, servants said they had heard him say, my poor country, a couple of times to himself. So he was stressed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's the automatic conclusion is suicide. It doesn't rule it out, and there is an entire possibility that he did die by suicide, but it is totally impossible to say. And I quite dislike the chapter in Chandler that sort of goes, well, he wasn't the type, as though there is a type. And I think that feeds into very much the stigmatization of suicide and the notion that you either are this type of person does it or this type of person doesn't. I think the only thing you can say is nobody knows. It's not impossible.
I love everything that you said there, because you're absolutely right. This idea that there is a type is just complete crap, to put not too fine a point on it. Because anything can happen to a person at any given point in time. And it, as you say, that doesn't necessarily mean that he did, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't. And the only person who will ever know is of course Berthier, who is the person at the center of the tragedy. Rachael, brilliant talking to you as ever. I guess one kind of follow-up question in terms of myths when it comes to Berthier, are there any that we haven't sort of covered that you just want to sort of encourage people to stick in the bin?
I think in terms actually of reputation, Bertie probably gets a fairly deserved one in that he was the essential marshal. He was not the great commander of the marshalate. He wasn't the one with the most dash or the most flair. He wasn't even the one with the most exciting personal life. But he absolutely was a man who was tremendously efficient at his job, who worked incredibly hard, and gets the reputation to go along with it. It is interesting to note, though, in terms of when we've talked about his relationships with other marshals, his legacy lives on in a sort of intermingled marshalate family tree, because Berthier's granddaughter, through his son Napoleon Berthier's daughter, Malcy Louise, marries Joachim Joseph, who is the fourth Prince Murat and Marshal Murat's grandson. So Joachim Joseph and Malcy Berthier have a son, also named Joachim, fifth Prince Murat, who marries Marie-Cécile Ney, who is the great-granddaughter of Ney. So if there is an afterlife, I really would love to know how Ney, Berthier and Murat reacted to their family trees intermingling, because the chap who holds the title today of Prince Murat is carrying the legacy of the bravest of the brave, the first cavalryman of Europe, and the most essential marshal. So that's quite a legacy to live up to.
It certainly is, isn't it? My God, that's kind of, so it almost sort of feels ever so slightly incestuous. Obviously it's not, but it's because these guys were so close and so pivotal to the history that we read and write about so much. That's a really kind of weird thought that their family trees just end up being so intertwined like that.
And a slightly sadder note is that Berthier's titles in the male line die out in World War One. There's actually 4 of his descendants fall in France's name in World War One. So the military legacy, sacrificing for your country, lived on as well.
Rachael, it's always brilliant talking to you. This one was, just like all the others, out of the top drawer of the podcasts. I know this will be incredibly popular. Thank you so much for your time. And we will be back with another installment of Marshal Mayhem, folks, very soon. What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your comments and questions, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Flewick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlem, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachael Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.